Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Indy. I'm the marketing manager for ANZ here at Daxi, and I'm very excited to be hosting this conversation with you today. We've got a great session lined up this evening, all about the latest in crowdfunding, where it's heading, and the Dacxi Chain. To speak on the subject, we have Daxi CEO Ian Lowe, who will have a lot of valuable insight to share with us. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic to Ian to kick us off.
Thanks, Indy. Is the audio coming through okay?
Coming through perfectly on my end.
Great. Okay, terrific. I'll assume that everyone can hear me. Well, listen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to give a fairly short presentation, a few minutes at the end to take a couple of questions. Without knowing exactly how many of you might be joining us for the first time, there's a couple of slides up front that just set the scene. And then as we go through the presentation, I want to share some insights from some recent industry events, an industry study that we've produced recently that we'll release in the next few days, and a quick update on the whole Dacxi Chain project. So with that in mind, we'll get started. If we can just go to the next slide, please, Indy. And look, as always, anything that we talk about today really shouldn't be considered to be investment advice. And obviously, you need to seek your own professional advice as it relates to any investment decisions that you make. So with that done, if we go to the next slide, please. I just want to start with the vision. This is obviously not just the driving force behind Dacxi Chain, but and with that, the use case for Daxi Coin. But this will tie itself in nicely, I think, to a couple of the insights that I want to share with you in this presentation. So really, Dacxi Chain is about leveraging the innovation of blockchain to create a high growth and global equity crowdfunding ecosystem. So that's a pretty simple statement. It's consciously ambitious, and as I say, I want to reference back to this vision statement as we work our way through the slides. Thanks, Indy. So let's just start with a quick 101. What is crowdfunding? Look, crowdfunding is a little bit like ice cream. It comes in a few different flavors. There's equity crowdfunding, where consumers can invest directly in a business in return for shares in that company. There's property crowdfunding, when a property is placed in a company so that the shares reflect ownership of that underlying property. There's peer-to-peer lending, where companies seek funding from investors rather than from a bank. Rewards-based crowdfunding, where investors can donate funds in return for goods or services or rewards. And then there's donation-based crowdfunding, which is just a straight donation. What I'm going to be talking about, and the whole Dacxi Chain vision, is all focused on equity crowdfunding. This is by far the largest market. It's by many, many times the largest market opportunity. But equity crowdfunding today also has some really significant challenges. And so I've just summarized some of the headline constraints for the equity crowdfunding industry today. And the central theme in all of these constraints is a lack of scale and the negative impact that has on all the different participants in equity crowdfunding. It negatively impacts the investor, it negatively impacts the early stage growth company that's looking for funding, and it negatively impacts the industry that is crowdfunding itself. So just some of the most important examples of the significant challenges that equity crowdfunding confronts today. Equity crowdfunding is essentially uncompetitive against venture capital, and therefore it misses out on the most exciting deals. They go to venture capitalists. And that's because of this lack of scale. There's just simply not enough capital available. The crowd is not big enough to attract the biggest and the most exciting deals where those deals would typically instead find their way to venture capital and be funded by venture capital. And what this means is that VCs have all the leverage in the innovation economy. So the capital that funds innovation, venture capitalists or VCs have all the leverage in that market. And today, they represent over 98% of the total capital that's invested in high growth private companies. Early stage businesses have limited options as a result to access the growth capital. And what that really means is where the VCs have all the leverage at the table, the growth company that's seeking the funding has no leverage. And so that translates into the deal terms, which typically significantly favour the VCs to the detriment of the entrepreneur or the early stage company that is seeking that funding. And so there's a real asymmetry in the marketplace by virtue of the dominance of the VCs, which in turn is a byproduct of the lack of scale in equity crowdfunding today. A corollary of this is that smaller equity crowdfunding companies are also disadvantaged versus the larger equity crowdfunding companies or platforms, which is probably true in many industries, but certainly in equity crowdfunding. Maybe the best way to think about that is that the smaller equity crowdfunding companies or platforms are further disadvantaged beyond all the things that I've already talked about. And so as a result, this global opportunity is constrained. There's enormous complexity across jurisdictions around different rules, different regulations. And so a global opportunity, this idea that, you know, we lack scale, how can we get bigger? How can we grow faster? How can we become global? There are natural constraints around different jurisdictions where there are different rules around how equity crowdfunding needs to be conducted. And a lot of the regulations in certain markets are really not fit for purpose. They limit competitiveness and they limit access. And there's lots of different examples of that. So look, in combination, these are really significant impediments to the accelerated growth of equity crowdfunding. And they all roll up into this common theme around a lack of scale, where the crowd is not big enough, the crowd being the retail investors. It just simply doesn't have enough scale to create enough opportunity to be able to compete with other sources of capital, in particular VCs. So the outcome of all of this, the conclusion, is that the access to this market for retail investors is limited. Everyday investors and entrepreneurs lose as a result of that, and VCs win. They have all the leverage in this asymmetrical market. So if we go to the next slide, you can now understand the genesis of the vision. The vision is in many respects a response to the constraints in the industry today, all of the limitations. So going back to that vision, we want to leverage the innovation of blockchain, this new technology called blockchain, to create a high growth and global equity crowdfunding ecosystem. So high growth and global all point to scale, the scale that the industry today doesn't have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're tracking with that project and the industry in general. Okay, thanks, Indy. So some of you may or may not be aware, we released a podcast very recently, but a couple of weeks ago I attended an event called Crowdfunding Week, and it's where the leaders across the crowdfunding industry come together once a year to reflect on the state of the industry, talk about their businesses and share insights, and also talk quite a bit about the future and where they believe the industry is going and the opportunities and challenges that creates. So I wanted to share with you a couple of the key points that came out of that event, which was just a wonderful opportunity to sit and discuss the industry with other CEOs. The event was attended by crowdfunding platforms. It was attended by entrepreneurs, looking to understand how to better engage with crowdfunding platforms and the industry in general. So it was a real cross-section of attendees and a really rich forum in which to explore and understand the way that the people who are leading this industry today, the way that they see the future. So if we just go to the next slide, there are really three primary themes that I wanted to share very quickly with you that came out of this. I mean, there's an enormous amount of information that was shared at the event. But there was one particular session where the CEOs of all of the world's leading platforms were sitting on stage, and they were asked the question at the end of this panel, where will this industry be in 5 years' time? And the answers were just so compelling and so aligned with everything we're doing on Dacxi Chain that I wanted to play this back for everybody. So the first point that came through really, really clearly was a belief that this tokenization revolution is going to transform investing in private companies, and that tokenization will become a universal global standard that provides access to retail investors everywhere. Okay, so it's a really interesting insight where tokenization is not just an emerging trend, it is absolutely seen as the future standard for the way that this will be done everywhere around the world. The second point was that investing in private companies will, in that 5-year period, become as simple and accessible as investing in any public company. So if you think about what that means, you think about what it takes to go in and set up an account, trade on an app, shares in a public company, and you think about that dynamic or that frictionless experience transposed into this vast universe of privately held businesses, it's a fundamental change in the way that the wealth creation and participation opportunity exists versus where it's come from. And so we're in the early stages of that journey, but the industry's firm view is that within a few years, it'll be just as easy to invest in a private company as it is to invest in a public company. And I think that end game being so within reach was a really compelling statement. And then the third was a point that was universally agreed in this panel session, which is that crowdfunding will become truly global. I mean, today we have a number of markets that are arguably more sophisticated or ahead of the curve than others. But all of these industry leaders see that it's completely inevitable that over a short period of time, equity crowdfunding will become genuinely global. So these 3 points, you can imagine how this resonated with me, given the Dacxi Chain project, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But basically, the leaders in the global industry see the future in exactly the same way that we do in terms of these key developments. Thanks, Indy. So, look, in a short period of time, we're going to release a report that we've produced that's really looking at crowdfunding on the global stage. And so I just wanted to give you a preview on a couple of the headline data points to come out of that report. There's a lot of information contained within it, but just a couple of the headlines in advance of the release of that report. Thanks, Indy. So we've already talked about sort of the different flavors of crowdfunding, and I think by now it's clear to everybody, if it wasn't previously, that Dacxi Chain is absolutely all about equity crowdfunding and turning that into a global ecosystem. So I just put this slide in here again, just to reference that as we go into these insights around equity crowdfunding specifically. Thanks, Indy. So if we look at the current state of equity crowdfunding on a global stage, it's interesting. There's approximately 200 companies in the world today that offer an equity crowdfunding solution. And look, in almost all cases, that's a platform, right? That's an online platform where an investor can register interest, take a look at a range of different investment opportunities in privately held businesses. And then if they choose, they can invest in those companies in exchange for equity. So there's about 200 of these platforms around the world today. Now, equity crowdfunding raised approximately just over $1.5 billion US in 2021. So that might feel like a big number. And certainly, if you can consider where it's come from, it is. But it's a number that really is put into perspective when it's compared to the amount of capital that was invested by VCs in early stage privately held companies over that same period, 2021. And VCs invested about $230 billion US over the same period. So in terms of market opportunity, market share, you can see that equity crowdfunding has enormous scope for growth. And when you consider that the growth that a global army of retail investors can bring to the innovation economy, it's all incremental. So it's not like $230 billion is the size of the market and, you know, it's just a battle for market share. As equity crowdfunding spreads its wings and becomes global and hits the growth trajectory that it absolutely can, then it will just exponentially grow the amount of capital that's available to early stage companies. So it's a really interesting point that we're not fighting over the size of the pie. We're growing the size of the pie by empowering equity crowdfunding to grow exponentially. These 200 companies that offer equity crowdfunding today are spread across all the most significant commercial regions in the world. And interestingly, in 97 countries today, equity crowdfunding is regulated. In other words, there are rules around how it needs to be conducted, and those rules are enforced by local regulators. So it is a highly regulated market, and that's consistent across the globe. Keep in mind that the number of crowdfunding companies or platforms in each market doesn't always correlate to the size of that market or the amount of capital that's invested in that market. So you look at a region like Europe, there's a very large number of crowdfunding platforms. There's certainly a significant player in terms of market size, but they certainly don't have 50% of global market share. So it's just an interesting point. There's an imbalance in a couple of markets as it relates to the number of platforms versus the market share. It doesn't correlate one-to-one in all cases. If we keep going, please, Indy. So in terms of so that's a little bit about the current state. In terms of the future state for equity crowdfunding, look, the market is going to continue to grow. And just as a reference point, anecdotally, the US market is growing at around about 100% year on year. We're also in a cycle of market consolidation. So as industries expand, they go through different cycles of diversification and consolidation. And we're in a cycle of consolidation at the moment. And that is simply that there's a small number of dominant equity crowdfunding platforms in each market. They're looking to be opportunistic. They're consolidating, acquiring, merging with other crowdfunding platforms to create an even more dominant presence if they can in that market or in those markets. So we're in a consolidation cycle at the moment. But the other point around future state is that the rate of growth is going to accelerate, and that acceleration will be driven by three primary factors. The first is tokenization of equity in privately held companies. So I've got another slide in a moment where I'll expand on that. But this is a journey that we're already on with or without crowdfunding, okay? So this is a macro trend that very much plays to the opportunity of Dacxi Chain, okay? There's a macro change, and that absolutely aligns with the opportunity for creating a global equity crowdfunding ecosystem. The second factor around accelerated growth is globalization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And the third is the technology and the innovation that comes with that technology itself. Okay, so the technology that empowers a retail investor to discover a private company that they're interested in and invest in that company directly, that technology is just constantly improving. The process is constantly becoming more seamless, more convenient, more accessible, more ubiquitous. So these are really the three primary factors that will contribute to growth acceleration for equity crowdfunding. If we just go to the next slide, please, Indy. So tokenization, you would have heard us talk about previously. This is projected to be a $1 trillion market by 2030. There's all sorts of sources that are quoting very similar numbers around the size of that market, whether it's Fanoa, in the case of this chart here, McKinsey have quoted very similar numbers. Deloitte's have come out this year with some similar projections. But that's obviously a really significant market. What tokenization does as it continues its journey and as the growth accelerates is it creates ubiquitous and universal access for retail investors. So that's what's happening here. We are on a journey where tokenization will start to provide access, unprecedented access, to everyday investors to invest in private companies that are growth companies with a fantastic future, and the opportunity to participate in that wealth creation through tokenization is no longer available only to the 1%. Okay, it's actually through tokenization available to everyone. We've looked at the size of the retail investor market and looked very conservatively. Our view is that there are 100 million or more investors in the world today that would have $10,000 or more to invest in an opportunity such as a high growth privately held company. And so what that tells you is that it's a $1 trillion market opportunity as we unlock the crowd, as we turn crowdfunding into a global proposition. And so, you know, I think by any measure, that's a phenomenally large market opportunity. And so this is why we're running as hard as we can to pioneer this. And this is why we think being the first is actually important, is because the size of the market opportunity really demands that we think that way. Let's keep going. Thanks, Indy. So that's tokenization. The second contributing factor being globalization. So look, all this means in simple terms is more countries starting to offer equity crowdfunding, more companies being funded through equity crowdfunding, and more capital being raised via equity crowdfunding. In simple terms, that's what it means. And of course, more companies will look to raise their growth funding from multiple countries. Now, that's really the window of opportunity that Dacxi Chain is very laser focused on, is this concept of using tokenization, which is a universally accessible technology, and decentralized and democratized. It was born that way, to leverage that innovation to create a universally accessible marketplace for equity crowdfunding. There are, however, some challenges. So there are inconsistent regulatory frameworks across different countries and jurisdictions. And so that, as it relates to creating a global crowdfunding solution, creates enormous complexity. So essentially the rules around how this should be done is different in every market. Okay, so that creates complexity as it relates to a global ecosystem. And so the question really is, how can equity crowdfunding actually become global? How will that happen? And so we have, won't surprise you, a very lucid view on how this will happen. So if we go to the next slide, there's essentially two models under which crowdfunding will become global: centralized and decentralized. So let me just quickly characterize each. Centralized is where a single company that operates across multiple entities and multiple countries builds a crowdfunding solution in each of those countries separately and severally. So it's a bit like Facebook or Google. They operate globally. They operate a separate business in each market. They leverage off the same common technology. And of course, it means that they essentially make centralized decisions that impact all of those markets, and it's all controlled through one entity or corporation. And of course, what happens as these companies grow is they become motivated by self-interest, they become protectionist, they become anti-innovation, and they become proprietary in their mindset, which means anti-ecosystem, anti-diversity, okay? They want one solution to rule the world. So that's the centralized model. The decentralized model, however, is really about saying, let's take a group of established and independent equity crowdfunding platforms and let's bring them together into a network. And that network has all sorts of significant benefits over the centralized model, okay? The first is that it's pro-diversity and it empowers each crowdfunding platform to actually grow the business they're already in. So it's not in any way competitive, quite the opposite. It empowers them to grow the business they've already built. The second thing is that all of those crowdfunding platforms are already licensed in the market in which they operate. So to provide a global ecosystem that ticks all of those regulatory boxes, it means that that network by definition is already licensed as per the regulations in each market in which that ecosystem exists. Okay, so if there's 50 companies in 40 countries and they're all licensed to meet local regulations, then that network is already compliant with all of those regulations across all of those markets. The really significant benefit, which goes to the heart of the problem that I described earlier, is that an ecosystem of established crowdfunding platforms coming together to create a global ecosystem delivers scale, and it delivers it fast. And that goes to the heart of the constraints in the industry today. And so that's an incredibly important and exciting element of a decentralized model. And really all we're saying is that all of these different equity crowdfunding platforms around the world are connected by a common protocol or technology infrastructure. And that technology infrastructure is Dacxi Chain. And we make that available to them as a platform as a service. So we're not a crowdfunding company that seeks to compete with them. We are a common protocol or infrastructure that allows them to come together to grow their business and form a global alliance and a global ecosystem to create immediate scale. So look, some of these things many of you will have heard me talk about before, but hopefully that paints the picture really clearly. The Dacxi Chain vision, the Dacxi Chain technology is under a decentralized model where we seek to empower the equity crowdfunding platforms that exist in the world today, as opposed to a centralized model where one company will essentially over a period of time grow into multiple markets and try to control the global ecosystem. Under a decentralized model, we can grow faster, we can get a better outcome, and we do it through partnership. Thanks, Indy. So back to that vision. I said I'd reference it a couple of times. I promise this is the last time. Leverage the innovation of blockchain to create a high growth and a global equity crowdfunding ecosystem. Hopefully by now, that's making a lot of sense for everybody. If we just move on, I've just got a couple of slides to finish off. So again, you've heard me describe this previously. How do we do that? We create a global ecosystem by linking independent, regulated crowdfunding platforms. Those platforms agree the deal. They expose that into the global ecosystem, and then we have that network effect on both the crowd side and also on the catalog of early stage high growth businesses that are offering an investment opportunity to those retail investors. We make the payment between the two equity crowdfunding companies through the global crypto system. The equity is issued as a token based on a smart contract. That's the tokenization component. And by virtue of tokenizing that equity and putting that into the hands of the retail investor, we can evolve into a global secondary market, custody, share registry, all of which we understand intimately. We've built solutions in these spaces before. And that's all a growth opportunity beyond the initial objective of delivering that global ecosystem. So that's just a little bit more on the how we do that, which I've probably in some ways already covered. Thanks, Indy. So very quickly, an update for you to finish up on the Dacxi Chain project. So if we just go to this next slide, please. So look, I'm really excited about this. We've never been moving faster on this project than we are today. Every week we're making really exciting progress as we build out all of the technology, and there's a lot of underlying complexity. You've heard me say that before, but we've really got our arms around that, and there's real momentum on that project. So the progress continues. That progress is accelerating. We've secured a number of equity crowdfunding partners. So that's the exciting news that we're sharing. Those partners are actively collaborating with us on this project. Okay, so this is not us sitting in a room with a great idea, far from it. We have established, recognized, sophisticated crowdfunding platforms who are partnering with us to bring this to market. We're also in discussion with additional foundation partners, equity crowdfunding partners. We remain absolutely on track for the public release and announcement of the first deals in the first half of next year. The second half of next year is really going to be about scaling the platform, so really accelerating with more equity crowdfunding partners, releasing more and more deal flow, really scaling the ecosystem. The plan is to share with our community and our clients who our equity crowdfunding partners are. So we will share that with you. It's a bit too soon for us to do that. There's a confidentiality dynamic that we think is important at this stage that we're going to preserve as much as anything out of respect for our partners. But I just want you to know we are going to share the names of those companies at the appropriate time. And we've already discussed that with those foundation partners. I also wanted to say that our foundation partners, we actually select them very, very carefully. So we look at those foundation partners. They're particularly important as it relates to getting the Dacxi chain in market, first deals through, and the platform off which we then scale that ecosystem. So for those foundation partners that we're working with now and others that we're talking to, we look at a whole range of things when we profile them as a partner candidate. How long have they been in market? How established are they? What's the sophistication of their platform, the feature set, their capabilities? What's their market reputation? And what sort of scale can they bring to this Dacxi chain ecosystem? So we look at all of those things really carefully, and I'm really excited about the equity crowdfunding partners that we're working with today. So I'm looking forward to sharing more of that with you very soon.